Hello and welcome to the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. This is your regular update for all your tillage news and advice. Access to affordable nitrogen has arguably been one of the most transformative elements in modern agriculture. However, it comes at a cost, both in terms of monetary value and potential damage to the environment. So getting the best out of every kilo of nitrogen applied to the farm is not only desirable, but necessary. Today we're joined by Dr Richie Hackett from Teagasc Oak Park to chat through how we might get the best from nitrogen applied to our crops. So Richie, it's been a wet winter so far and grounds have been saturated up to a short few weeks ago. Will this mean there will be less nitrogen available to plants this year?
Well, I suppose, Michael, all winters in Ireland are wet, and so whether it's very wet or just normal wet, most of the nitrogen that's in the soil is going to be lost, or a fair amount of it will be leached out of the soil. So I would say that there's no reason to believe that there'll be less available. There certainly won't be more than normal, but I don't think there's any reason to believe there'll be less than normal. Other countries measure soil nitrogen. Anytime we've looked at it, it hasn't shown to be particularly useful under our conditions. And what happens between now and harvest will have a bigger impact on how much nitrogen becomes available to the crop from the soil.
Okay, and thinking about that, obviously there's a nice bit of nitrogen already gone out to winter crops already, probably gone out a couple of weeks or more, and there's been a little bit of rain, a good bit of rain actually in some circumstances out there already. Do you think there's any potential for loss of any of that nitrogen that's already been applied?
I think it probably has moved down the profile a bit, but it's unlikely to have been lost out of the soil at this stage. And obviously, as the year progresses, the plants will be sending down roots deeper and deeper, and they will retrieve most of that, assuming we don't get a very, very wet spell, in the next month or 6 weeks. So, in short, except perhaps on very sandy soils, I don't think any of that nitrogen will have been lost via leaching. There's always possibilities some of it will have been lost due to production of nitrogen due to denitrification, but that the amount that would have been lost via that pathway would be very small, agronomically speaking.
Okay, and I suppose it's probably pretty cold for that. It wouldn't exactly help it. And I suppose in thinking about that, soil temperatures are around, I don't know, 8 degrees or somewhere thereabouts. Is that the kind of temperature where we can expect growth to kind of kick in, and kind of in the same kind of vein, when or what sort of soil temperature is needed for growth to significantly ramp up, if you like?
Well, I suppose once you get above 5 or 6 degrees, growth will start to increase linearly as temperatures increase above that. So as you go from, say, 5 or 6 degrees to 10 degrees, you'll get an increase in growth. And then as you go above 10 degrees, it will continue to increase up to somewhere in the mid-teens, and then soil temperature will have less of an effect. So I would say we're at the beginning, assuming temperatures don't drop again, we're at the beginning of sort of a burst of some spring growth, which is badly needed at this stage in many crops.
It is, yeah. And so, right, the early nitrogen is on at the moment, so the main split will probably be due relatively quickly, and maybe on some of the winter cereals. What sort of timings should farmers be looking at to apply that, the next main split, if you like? And maybe if we start maybe with winter barley and go through the winter crops from there.
Well, I suppose if we start with winter barley, as you say, I mean, ideally you'd like to have the main split of nitrogen on by around growth stage 31 or thereabouts. So that'll be sometime over the next 2 weeks for many crops. And for say winter wheat, then again you'd be applying the main split somewhere between growth stage 30 and 31, which is probably a little bit further away with wheat than it is for barley crops, for most of the crops I've seen anyway. And I suppose the other winter crop, winter oats, you'd be aiming your second split or your main split at around growth stage 32 or thereabouts on the winter oats.
And I suppose with the winter oats, I suppose the research from Oak Park would suggest that keep it earlier rather than later, I suppose, to try and protect hectolitre weight.
Yeah, as you go past growth stage 32, you'll tend to have a negative effect on hectolitre weight, which is obviously a key criteria of grain quality in oats. So you like to have it on at around growth stage 32 and not any later.
And maybe when we're just touching upon all those crops, just in terms of the final application, or is that the final application for most of those winter cereal crops?
Well, for winter oats, I would say yes. You'd be usually looking at a 2-split program, the second one at growth stage 32, as I said. For the winter wheat and winter barley, you have the option of going with 3 splits if you wish. Any of the research that we've done would suggest there's no great benefit in terms of yield from using a 3rd split. But we spoke about rainfall earlier. If you put on a large main split and you get a lot of rain afterwards, there is always the risk that some of it may be lost. Whereas if you keep back some of that main split for a 3rd split later in the season, it's obviously that little bit safer. So from an environmental point of view, it's probably a good idea to use a 3-split program. From an agronomic point of view, it doesn't make a lot of difference whether you use 2 splits or 3 splits. In terms of when should you put on your 3rd split, well, if you're going with a 3rd split on winter wheat, you'd usually aim it around growth stage 37, just around when the flag leaf is coming out, or not later than that. And on winter barley, somewhere maybe around somewhere between growth stage 31 and 32, probably about 10 days after putting on your 10 days to 2 weeks after putting on your main split.
And when you talk about winter barley, is there a differential at all between the conventional winter barleys and the hybrid winter barleys in terms of a lot of growers, maybe even people in the industry, would be talking about this later application of nitrogen seems to help in the hybrids. Is there any evidence that we have for that?
That's not something that we have looked at and in any great detail, but any of the work that I've done with hybrid versus conventional varieties, they act very, very similarly. The hybrids react to most inputs virtually identically to the conventional variety, non-hybrid varieties.
Okay, and when we think about nitrogen, I suppose there's the next thing that people probably think about very quickly is sulfur. What about sulfur in these crops? Is it should it be going on at the same time, or maybe more the question is, when is it too late to start applying sulfur?
Well, ideally, you'd have your sulfur allocation for the crop going on with either with the 1st split, or certainly with the 2nd split, and have it completed at the 2nd split. I wouldn't be inclined to be holding back sulfur for the 3rd split if you're going with a 3rd split. So I'd aim to have all my sulfur allocation on by time I have the 2nd split completed. So sulfur is utilized within the plant at the same time as nitrogen. It helps to improve the efficiency of use of nitrogen within the plant. So you basically want the 2 of them going on at the same time.
And the rate, Richie, somewhere around 15, 20 kilos, or where's the rate?
Yeah, typically for cereals, in the vast majority of cases, 15 kilos per hectare is more than enough. The high risk scenario for sulfur deficiency is where you're on a light sandy soil, where you have long-term tillage, so relatively low organic matter, and you have no history of organic matter application. That's where you're likely to get sulfur deficiency. And conversely, if you're on a heavier soil, or if you have a history of organic manures being applied to the particular field, or if it's not a very wet winter, the response to sulfur will be much lower, if indeed there is any response to sulfur.
Okay, so we might just switch a little bit then to some of the spring crops. And looking forward to the forecast, it looks pretty good. It looks like there's a week or maybe 10 days of dry weather coming up. So presumably there'll be a good bit of spring barley and spring cereals being planted. And thinking about the likes of spring barley being one of the biggest crops out there, should growers be applying nitrogen to seed beds now at this stage?
Well, I think I would always apply some nitrogen to the seedbed of spring barley, except perhaps if I was sowing very early. So if I was sowing sort of the middle of February or something like that, I probably think about not applying nitrogen to the seedbed. But once you get into March, I would always apply some proportion of my total nitrogen in the seedbed, just to get the crop going when the crop starts to grow, that it has some access to nitrogen in the soil. So certainly, yeah, from now on, you would certainly be applying nitrogen in the soil, and most growers will be using a compound fertilizer, NPK compound in the seedbed, and that will suffice to get the crop going.
So what, the guts of maybe 30-40 kilos of nitrogen in the seedbed is enough, is it?
Yeah, that would be plenty. So that spring barley crop will take up very little nitrogen until it gets into the mid-tillering stage, and 30 or 40 kilos will be more than enough to satisfy the crop's demand up until that stage. And obviously, if you put more than that on, you are at risk if you get a very wet spell that some of that could be lost. And obviously, spring barley is a crop that if you do have light ground, it's probably where light sandy ground, it's probably where you'll put your spring barley, and that would be a high risk at high risk of loss in that situation. So putting a high amount on early in the seedbed wouldn't be really advisable in that situation.
Okay, and does that change any for malt and barley? There appears to be I suppose a bit of thinking out there that trying to put all the nitrogen into spring barley, spring malt and barley is the way to go, and perhaps people maybe have the lower protein content eventually at the end of the year in mind. But is that the good way to go, or should we be thinking a little bit more holistically about it?
Well, we did a lot of work on that, a few years ago, comparing timing of nitrogen on spring barley, and what we found was that the timing of the nitrogen on spring barley has very little effect on either yield or protein. What really has the effect is the total amount applied. When you apply it isn't very all that important. And we did look at putting a lot of nitrogen on at sowing versus holding a greater proportion of it back for later in the season, applying it at mid-tillering, and where we applied, maybe 70-80% of the nitrogen into seedbed versus applying 25-30% into seedbed, with the remainder applied at mid-tillering, we could find no differences in either yield or protein over a run of years. So I would say putting a lot or all of the nitrogen into the seedbed isn't really going to have much effect on your protein or your yield, except the one exception I would say is if you get a very wet spell after putting on all that nitrogen, some of it is going to be lost, and then you're going to get lower proteins, but you're going to get lower proteins because what you put on was lost, and it would be more environmentally friendly and more economically beneficial if you just put on a little bit less later in the season, rather than putting it on to be lost.
So the same applies as we were chatting about before, 30 or 40 kgs in the seedbed, more than enough to get it up and going, and the remainder then at mid-tillering, and that's your best of all worlds, really.
Yeah, because malting barley and feed barley are essentially how the crop doesn't know whether it's malting or feed, so it's doing the same thing irrespective of whether it's destined for malt or feed. So I would treat them both similarly. The only difference is the amount that you would apply, in the total amount that you would apply over the season would be lower for the malting barley than for feed barley, obviously.
Okay. Richie, I've one final question for you. It's a lovely day out there, and I know you've lots of work out in the field to get back to some of the trials. So the final question I just have for you is, the price of fertilizer has increased quite substantially over the last few weeks. So getting the most from nitrogen is very important. And if you had one or two kind of key actions which are central for farmers in terms of getting the best out of nitrogen, what would they be?
Well, I suppose the first one is to apply the nitrogen when the crop actually needs it. So timing your nitrogen, and we have obviously discussed that earlier in the podcast as to what the correct timings are. That's probably your main lever for maximizing the effectiveness of your fertilizer. And I suppose the second one would be to try get the amount as close to optimum as you can. That's not always easy because we know the optimums is quite variable between sites and seasons. But if you follow the recommendations, you should get as close as you're going to get, and that by putting on the correct amount of nitrogen, that will obviously avoid wastage. Where you put on a lot of nitrogen, your crop might look very, very green and look well, but the crop isn't actually able to use more than what's being recommended for it, and so you're effectively wasting expensive fertilizer at that stage.
That's brilliant, Richie. Thanks very much for your time. Some very straightforward, science-based answers there. So it's terrific to get those very well supported, if you like, in the trials you've been doing over the last 20 years. So Richie, thanks very much for your time, and we'll speak to you again.
No problem, anytime, Michael.
So that's it for the Tillage Edge, and my thanks to Richie for joining me on the podcast. The next episode in the series of the Crop Agronomy webinars is on Tuesday, the 6th of April at 11:30 a.m. And for more details, go to teagasc.ie/events. Don't forget, if you like this podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more farming news, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy. Thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.